Okay, this section is going to cover lipids. So the thing to remember with lipids is these are the one class that are hydrophobic by nature. And so what that means is they're going to have a lot of carbons and hydrogen bonds, but not really any oxygens. So we will see some oxygen in here, but they're mostly going to be all carbon and hydrogen. Glucose, sugars like that have a lot of OH groups, and proteins, amino acids have a lot of nitrogen and H2 groups, but we don't see very many of those with fatty substances. So the first thing we start off with the lipids, and these are a little bit different because instead of being long polymers, they are a polymer of 3. So the backbone of a fat molecule looks like this. It's called a triacyl. You might see triacylglycerol. That's kind of another term for that. But basically, this is the backbone of carbon, and there's 3 binding sites. This allows for 3 fatty acid molecules to bind to this backbone. And those fatty acids are long chains of carbon surrounded by hydrogens. And they can come in a couple different forms. They can be saturated or unsaturated. So saturated means that the carbons are all single bonds. If it's unsaturated, you're going to have a carbon single bond, but then you might have a carbon double bond. And so what that means is this double bond here could actually form more attachments to hydrogens, but they don't. Thus, we call them unsaturated. So if you, kind of the rule is if you see double bonds, those are unsaturated fats. If they're all single bonds, then they're saturated fats. And so we know saturated ones come mostly from animal products, meats and things like that. Unsaturated ones generally come from plants, vegetable oils and things like that. So when we look at a triacyl that's bonded to 3 fatty acids, we don't see huge polymers that are lipids. They come in groups of 3 because of this triacyl backbone. That's a little bit different. One specific type of lipid that's unique that kind of breaks this hydrophobic rule is called a phospholipid. So a phospholipid has a phosphate group and a lipid group. And so how that looks is there's a head of it that is a phosphate, PO4, and this has some negative charge on it. And so this is the part that we call hydrophilic. It also has 2 tails. These are lipids, and those are hydrophobic. These typically form the membranes in our cells, and they form a bilayer. So you will see the hydrophilic phosphate head on one side, and then on the other side of the membrane, it will be the other way. And this is because the inside and the outside of the cells are made up of a lot of water. And so they orient themselves that way because these parts will interact with water, but they don't necessarily allow water to pass through it. Water doesn't pass easily through our membrane. It needs channels in order to do so. There's a special class. One of the things I forgot to mention on this first slide is these parts here in blue. These are called ester linkages. So this is one of the points where we will have an oxygen that forms. So if I have my backbone, there will be an oxygen there that links to my fatty acid number 1, links to fatty acid number 2, and this one will link to fatty acid number 3. And each of these fatty acids could be different. Like this one could be saturated, this one could be unsaturated, and this one could be either or. So let's just make another saturated one. And sort of all three of these together make up the whole fat molecule. So sometimes they can be saturated, partially unsaturated, and saturated again here as well. So that wraps up pretty much everything for lipids, aside from the stuff that we'll talk about in class. That belongs under the lipid category, and those are called steroids. Not going to get into steroids too much here, but basically sort of the thing to remember with them is they have a 4-ring structure to them. So here's ring number 1, ring number 2, and then they kind of build a ring up here, ring number 3, and then ring number 4. So it looks something like this. And then they generally have sort of a chain coming off there. So this is kind of what we see as a steroid. And each steroid's a little bit different. So one steroid might have an OH group coming off of here. Another one might have an amine group out here. A different one might have like a carboxylic acid group down here. So every steroid is different, and what it does is different. But they all have this core black structure where there's 4 rings, and then there's a chain that comes off of them. And so that's a unique sort of class within lipids, one that we won't spend too much time on, but one that we'll see a little bit of. Last little bit here.